During this SukkAH, we're talking about getting our bodies in shape. And so to inspire you towards doing exactly that and to inspire myself as well, I want to tell you the story of the greatest race that has ever been run in modern times. And it is a race that went from coast to coast across the United States of America. Now, it's only been run one time. And the reason for that is because there were a number of people that died in the process of trying to run this race. It was done back in the 1930s when America was in a Great Depression. And one of the financiers of America that wanted to try and help it get back on its feet thought that if they had the world's greatest long-distance race, that it would bring encouragement back to the people and take their minds off of the poverty that was everywhere. Of course, if you're a true barbarian and you study, the Great Depression was not a natural event. It was caused by financiers and very smart but diabolical people who wanted to ride the backs of working men. All economic crises are because of that. But this is a happy thing. This is a story. It's a love story, really. And it comes from my home state of Oklahoma. And there was a young man who used to run to school about 5 miles each way because he came from a very poor family in the Oklahoma Dust Bowl days. And his parents were very... like many farmers in Oklahoma in that day, they just had barely enough to get by on, sometimes just one meal a day. He was also Native American, and that was the place of many Native Americans, as you know, from the Trail of Tears back in the 1830s. Well, this young man's name was Eric. He'd never played any sports, didn't have time to. He had to work the farm with his dad. And his mother was not in good health. And times were just tough. But Eric fell in love with a beautiful young lady. And back in those days, a man had to have a house in order to be considered a proper suitor for any young lady. Not many people went to college, so after high school, if they could afford it or if their parents could help them get started, they would set up on a farm or a ranch in Oklahoma and then they could get married. Eric had a problem. His farm was small. His father's farm was barely able to just feed his brothers and sisters. And so Eric was kind of stuck. He was a poor boy, and his Suzette, his love of his life, who loved him also, but whose parents were adamant that they couldn't even date unless Eric became successful in something, got some money, and built her a house. Actually, this is according to the original scriptures as well. It's kind of built in our heart. And we're going to be talking about that in these coming days in SukkAH, how that after you get your body in shape, you're to get a house. Well, Eric didn't have a house. He was in pretty good shape, running 10 miles a day to school and then working on the farm. But he heard about this race, coast to coast, all the way from Los Angeles to New York. Well, nobody had ever run that far. That's 3,000. That's over 3,000 miles, about 3,200 miles. And it actually pioneered the famous Route 66. That was the first transcontinental roadway that was available. And so they were going to run that, which actually ran right near Erik's farm in Oklahoma. Well, he got enough goodwill wishers and stuff to get get out to the West Coast to California. He didn't have any running shoes. All he had was his farm boots. He didn't have any running clothes. He didn't have a coach. And in fact, when the newspapers were interviewing people and they saw this farm boy from Oklahoma, happened to be the youngest one there, they asked him what race he'd ever run. He said, "I've never run a race." He said, "Well, who's your coach?" And Eric had befriended an old farmer who actually from Oklahoma that had taken him out there. And so he said, Mr. Benjamin, he's my coach. They went over and talked to Mr. Benjamin and said, how many runners have you coached? He said, never coached one. He said, well, you're out here with the longest distance race that's ever been won. What chance do you think that Eric would have? He doesn't even have running shoes. He's got those old farm boots on. And old man Benjamin said, well, he's a fine boy. And on top of that, he's in love. And he needs that money so he can marry his love. And they said, well, you've got the finest runners in the whole world here. I mean, to win this $1 million purse. What chance do you think that he has against the world's greatest runners? And old man Benjamin said, he'll win. They said, how can you say that? Have you practiced any? No. Have you trained for this? No, sir. Well, then how do you know that he'll win? He said, well, he said, my dog died. And they said, what do you mean your dog died? He said, yeah, he says, I'm a sheep farmer, and my dog died. And young Eric over there, he came over to help me, and he's the reason I kept my farm. So he'll win. And they asked him even more, said, we don't understand. What's the connection between your dog dying and young Eric winning? He said, well, you'll see. What they didn't know was that Eric actually took the place of his sheepdog that used to bring in his sheep and his goats every night. And so after running 5 miles to school and 5 miles back home and then working on his own farm, Eric went over to help old man Benjamin there to get his farm, his sheep in the corral for the nighttime. And so he would run all over the landscape, herding old man Benjamin's sheep. He'll win. And he said, and besides that, he's in love. He'll win. Well, the account of the race. Now, this race has only been run one time because it was so brutal that there were people actually that were became unable to function for the rest of their life. I mean, torn tendons. People wanted it so bad. There were so many of them that were desperate for money for this thing and that. And there were a number of them that died. Very few of them even finished the race. And in fact, after about 15 days of the race, and it was a flat-out race. It wasn't like you had time to rest. They just hit it first one to the Atlantic Ocean. Won. And so they didn't even have it organized on exactly what route you had to take. It was just a flat-out first one there, winner takes all. So the first couple of days, Eric was way back behind the leaders. But he just kept plodding. Wore out the soles on his boots. One of the reporters had such compassion for him that he went and bought him a pair of tennis shoes or sneakers. First pair of new shoes he'd ever had. And Eric already had some blisters on his foot, but not like the other ones. And in fact, they started losing so much blood. Some of the leaders did from the blisters on their feet that they started dropping out from just pure exhaustion. You know, it was a brutal, brutal race. No holds barred, flat out, first one to the finish line. And there it kept plodding, plodding, plodding. All he took was some hard-boiled eggs. Benjamin had decided those hard-boiled eggs is the best thing for you. And so he carried a whole bunch of hard-boiled eggs, and he drank water, and gave him a little bag full of salt that he could lick on as he went along. And by about the 10th day into the race, Eric was near the leaders. And they began to comment on this young man. He had such determination. He just ran and ran and ran and would stop, sleep a couple hours, get up, and start running again. And before long, Eric was the leader. All the others, their feet just bleeding. They actually had to decide, the committee had to decide if it's okay to do blood transfusions. They weren't initially supposed to have any outside aid, but there was nobody left except Eric in the race, and even Eric was getting very worn down from the toil of the race. And so they allowed blood transfusions, allowed some of them to catch up with Eric, and then some reporters decided, well, you know, Eric ought to have the same as they do, so he arranged for Eric to have a blood transfusion as well. And Eric pulled away from the pack again. Finally, the last day of the race, there was no one even within a 2 days run of Eric. But Eric's feet were all blistered up. His sneakers were red from the blood that had come out of his feet. They would have to stop. He would have to stop every couple of hours and pop the blisters, and then he would just have to keep his fluids up. And Eric won that race hands down. The greatest long-distance runner, as far as we know, of human history. He took his prize money, and this is an amazing thing. The first thing he did was he gave half of it back to the runners that had been part of the race. He said, $500,000 is more than I need. He said, beside, all he knew was Jesus at that time, but he knew to love your neighbors as yourself. Simple farm boy, Oklahoma Eric, gave half of his earnings to his fellow runners to say, we're all in this together. He took his $500,000, went home to Oklahoma, paid off his parents' farm, then he paid off all of his neighbors' farms, and he bought him a farm for Susie, and he built her a house. It wasn't an elaborate house, but it was a house of love. And if you ever get a chance to go down Highway 66 through Oklahoma, and you go just past Claremore, Oklahoma, Will Rogers' old hometown, there's a monument if you ask people where it is. It's not very well known. Sometimes it's covered with weeds because I think I'm about the only one who cuts the weeds from it. But I go there a couple of times a year, and I think about the great story of this young man, the greatest runner, probably of human history. It brings tears to my eyes to think it's a story of love, a story of passion. And you know, I'm so grateful that Yahuwah made a way for people like Eric, who didn't know Yahuwah because nobody knew it back in the times of the Gentiles back then. But I want to go one day when I step on across to the other side. After I go and wake up my grandmothers and my granddaddies and some of my aunt and uncles that didn't know Yahuwah and finish the story, I'm going to go find Eric and his sweet love, Suzanne. Say, Eric, I never met you, but your story inspired me for decades. Can I finish the story of the God of love? His name was Yahuwah. Have a great day.